All right. Hello, friends. Let's see here if we're making sure we're all ready to go. Trying something out with a new microphone here. I mean, I've used it before, but not for Bible study, so let me know if it's very quiet or very loud. Say hi in the chat if you're here. It's always nice to know who's in. Let's see here. I think we got it all set. It should look right and sound right. Hi, Jude. Good to see you. Yay! Hi, Robin. Hi, Brian. Hi, Marianne. Hi, Nikki. Hi, Julia. Good to see you all. Hi. I assume then that you can hear me all right. So tell me if the sound is super loud or super quiet, because I can mess with it. But I'm really glad that you're here. Thanks for saying hi. Oh, good. Nikki says it sounds good so far. Cool. Well, it's good to see you all. It's good to be here. There's Ryan and Aaron and Titus. Oh, hi, Titus. Yeah, long time no see for sure. Good to see you. Awesome. So glad you're all here. It is Monday night. If you have not yet lost track of the days, it's Monday. So I'm glad to have you here on our Monday night stream. We are going to be talking about the story of a story about Lazarus tonight. So that's going to be our main thing. But I kind of just want to hang out for a second and see how you're all doing. There's Erica and sweet. Good. All right. I'm glad it's sounding good and looking good. Yeah, so we're talking about one of the stories about Lazarus tonight. Probably the most famous one is Jesus raising Lazarus. So that's what we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk a little bit about grief and a little bit about dying and a little bit about dealing with hard stuff, which I know sounds really fun. But I feel like it's something that we need to be talking about right now, and we're going to do it in, I hope, a way that is realistic and hope-filled at the same time. So we're going to be reading an interesting story to help us think about these topics. So I think maybe I'll start by saying that the reason that I was thinking about what story to read tonight in light of what's going on in our world. And I wanted something that we could read that would touch on grief and death and how we deal with those things. And as I was looking through the Bible to just casually flipping through the Bible, I was looking for stuff that would kind of fit that topic or that lens. And there's so much in the Bible that we can read that can teach us about grieving and lament. But it's not always, some of it feels less applicable right now than other bits. For instance, the book of Lamentation, or Lamentations, depending on how you want to say it. Lamentation is a book that is exactly about grief and terrible things happening, right? But it's also in the context of the people of Israel being like, we screwed up big time, and that's why bad things are happening. I am very skeptical of people of faith who are saying that this pandemic that we are experiencing is because we've sinned in some kind of grievous way as a species. That touches all my wrong buttons. So I didn't want us to read a text that had to do with punishment and sin, because I don't really think that's what we're dealing with here. I think what we're dealing with is a tragedy, and tragedies happen. And there are points in the Bible where people deal with tragedy and deal with things that are really bad happening to them for no fault of their own, right? Bad things happen in life. That's part of life. So I thought this story would be one that could actually be kind of helpful to us, to look at a story of a person dying and how the people around this person react, including how Jesus reacts. So that's why we're reading the story of the resurrection of Lazarus tonight. Of course, the thing that makes the Lazarus story a little less applicable to us is that Lazarus is raised, right? Jesus is standing right there and does this cool miracle and brings Lazarus back. And for those of us who are grieving somebody who we have lost, who, like Jesus, isn't standing there able to bring them right back, that's a distance between this story and what we're dealing with here. So I don't want to say it's exactly the same thing or it's exactly applicable, but I think there's a lot that this passage can teach us. So that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. Oh, Julia, good. You said you emailed me back. I know. Y'all, my inbox is a mess right now. So if you have emailed me, I promise I will get back to you soon. It's just been a wild time out here, as you all well know. So let me put up our little text thing. There we go. Oh, it's on a white wall, of course. Let me see if I can move the text somewhere else. No, it doesn't want me to. So the text is going to be over there in the corner, and it's going to be a little bit... let's see if I can move the camera. That might help. Nope, other way. There we go. Now you can read the text a little bit better. So you can also see some pans and dishes. This is what happens when you work from home. So that's our text for tonight, John 11:17 through 44. And that's what we're going to be looking at. So if you want to get out your nearest Bible, even if that Bible is at hand or if it's online, wherever you find your nearest Bible, turn to John 11 and we're going to start reading together. If you would like a link, I'm going to put a link in the chat here. There we go. So there's a link in chat for a online Bible version, so you can read that if you don't have one handy. And you can choose the translation that you like the best. I'm going to be reading out of the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV. That's the version that is used most in my tradition, and so it's the one that I'm kind of used to. But if you want to read in a different version and you want to tell us if you find some interesting differences between what I read and what your version says, I am pumped to talk about those. So let us know if there are some major differences. Now, because this is a big chunk of text, this is verses 17 to 44, it's a big chunk, we're going to read it in three sort of different segments, or a couple of different segments at least. So we are going to start out by reading verses 17 through 27. So we're going to kind of start there with that first chunk. So 17 through 27 is what we'll start with. So I'm going to start reading. You can follow along. Let me know if you find any interesting differences. So the first couple of verses go like this. Oh, maybe I should give you, before I start, because we're starting in verse 17, let's think about a little bit of background here. The background is Lazarus is the brother of two women named Mary and Martha. So we got three siblings here, Mary, Martha, Lazarus. And they are friends of Jesus. And somebody sends word to Jesus and says, hey, just so you know, your friend Lazarus is sick. And just so you know, maybe go visit him. And Jesus says, no, I'm going to wait. I'm going to go visit him later. And basically, that's kind of the background to this story, is Jesus saying, I'm not going to go to Lazarus right now. I'm going to go later. And so that's kind of, Jesus is very distant in the way that he says it. It's very, the verses up to this, for instance, Jesus says that Lazarus has just fallen asleep. And so Jesus, which is sort of a metaphor, what's the word I want? It was a euphemism for dying at this time. So Jesus kind of has a little bit of distance. He says, Lazarus has just fallen asleep, and now that Lazarus is dead, I'm going to go wake him up. So that's sort of the background to what we have going on here. So, starting in verse 17, it says this. When Jesus arrived at Mary and Martha and Lazarus' house, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany, where they lived, was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." So that's our first section. First of all, if there were any differences that you noticed between your version and the one I just read, feel free to throw those in the chat because they're always interesting, at least to me. But my second question, or I guess my first question besides translation differences for us here, is why do you think Jesus waited so long to go visit these siblings? They were friends of his, and he knew that Lazarus was sick, and by the time he gets there, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. So why does Jesus wait? What's the sort of like, why does Jesus seem so nonchalant about death? And how does that make us feel? How does it feel to see Jesus being very nonchalant about death? What's that feel like? I think that's always one of the things that first jumped out to me when I read this story is, gosh, Jesus is sure chill about this whole thing. One of his friends is like sick and dying, and he's very chill about it. He's even chill when he meets Martha at first. He's like, I don't know, he seems very, not at peace about it, but he's not bothered in a way that you would expect if your friend had died. So any thoughts about that? Any thoughts about why Jesus seems pretty nonchalant and unbothered? One thing that I think... hang on. Jude is pointing out the end of verse 25, "Yet shall he live," in Jude's version. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. Yep, I'm seeing that. Amory says he doesn't seem anxious about his friend's death. Yeah, he seems very not anxious about it. In fact, he seems like very taking it in stride, which I don't know about you all, but feels really weird to me. It feels weird to me that Jesus is like, well, all right, that's the way it is. But he also, but not in a, it's not accepting. Here's my 2 cents on this first bit with Jesus, is I almost see Jesus as being in a little bit of denial, or denial's not the right word. He looks like he's accepting the situation for what it is, when in reality, he has been saying all this stuff about how Lazarus is not really dead and he's going to rise again. And so it's like Jesus looks very chill about the whole situation, but it's like maybe he only looks chill because he knows what's about to happen. He knows this resurrection thing is about to happen. So I think that's maybe why it feels so weird to us, is we're like, geez, Jesus, like he's very calm about this whole thing. But what if he's only calm about it because he knows that Lazarus is going to come back? Like he kind of knows the secret ending already. Julia says maybe he's not worried because he knows that God cares for everyone. Yeah, I mean, that's another great point. Like maybe even if Lazarus had stayed dead, like spoiler alert for the end of the story, Lazarus doesn't stay dead. But like if Lazarus had stayed dead, maybe Jesus would still be very much taking this in stride, because for Jesus, death is maybe not something that's as scary as it is for us, right? Maybe Jesus, because Jesus knows not just the ending to Lazarus' story, but knows the ending to like our whole story, maybe death in general is not something that Jesus is super concerned about. And like, toward the end of Jesus's life, when he's going to the crucifixion, we do get a moment, in on the Mount of Olives in Gethsemane, where he feels a little anxious about this whole thing. But in general, Jesus seems pretty chill about death in general. Amory says lacks existential anxiety. Yep, that's very true. Like, you can imagine if Jesus is like, I already know what's going to happen after death. Like, I feel pretty confident about it. Maybe he doesn't have that same anxiety that we do. On the other hand, I think for sort of one of the things that I love about Christian theology is the understanding of Jesus as like 100% God and 100% human, right? And the idea that Jesus could be totally human without that existential anxiety seems a little like, if you really know the end of the story, are you really getting the full human experience? So that question kind of makes me think like maybe he doesn't totally know what's going to happen, but maybe he just trusts that whatever's going to happen, God will be in control of it, right? So maybe there's that. I don't know. Aaron says, I perceive it more as though Jesus knew it was necessary for him to reveal more of himself to them, that he was capable of conquering death, and he knew more would believe in him after seeing that. For clarity, Jesus knew Lazarus' death was necessary. Yeah. So Aaron, you're kind of saying like, maybe Jesus is so calm about it because he knew that this was all sort of for the greater good in a way, that Jesus kind of knew that like this was something that was all part of the plan. That could definitely be. Robin says, maybe this is an example of Jesus having a faith that God would demonstrate that death is powerless. Is it prior knowledge or faith? Yes, exactly. So Robin, that's a great way of sort of succinctly putting together what I was saying earlier. Like maybe it's Jesus having that knowledge and that's why he's not freaked out. Or maybe it's just Jesus trusting that God is a loving God who takes care of us and therefore there's nothing to be afraid of. I don't know. I think both of those are very possible. Very good answers. So I want to turn to Mary in this first section, or Martha rather, not Mary, in this first section for a minute, because Martha, to me, has a super realistic response. Jude points out maybe Jesus wasn't lacking in concern, but maybe just playing it cool till he knew what was fully going on. It's a leader thing to take on. I mean, yeah, sometimes you're just like, I don't really know what's going to happen yet, but I got to stay calm because everybody around me needs me to stay calm, like in that leadership position. That could be. So looking at Martha for a second, and what goes on with Martha, because Martha to me has a really relatable reaction. At least I think so. So in verse 21, Martha says to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And then she says, but even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. So thinking about Martha and her experience here, what do you, I guess my question is, do you think Martha is saying this in an accusatory way? Do you think Martha is mad at Jesus? Because to me, it reads a little bit like she's mad at Jesus, right? That she's saying like, Lord, if you would have just been here when we called for you, then we wouldn't have to go through this whole thing, right? So I kind of read Martha as angry at Jesus about this. And yet she has that second sentence where she says, I know now though that like whatever you ask of God, God will give you. So I'm wondering what your read is on Martha. Is she angry? Is she, when she says that thing about, I know God will give you whatever you ask for, is she trying to ask Jesus to raise Lazarus, kind of like in a roundabout way? Because at this point, Jesus hasn't, that's not a thing that he's like really known for doing, raising dead people, at least in the Gospel of John. He does lots of miracles, but he's not like known for that specifically. I wonder what you think Martha's deal is. Is she mad? Is she pleading? Is she, what's she doing there? Aaron says, I wish I could hear Martha's tone of voice. It could be accusatory or just acknowledging Jesus' power. Yeah, it's true. She could have said it like, if you would have just been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Or she could have said it like, I know, I don't know how to put that in a tone of voice, but it could have been more emphasis on I know if you were only here, he would be okay. Like more of a not accusatory, but acknowledging that like Jesus could have done something if he'd been there, and it's sad that he wasn't, but she's not mad at him for it. That's possible. Jude and Julia both say yes and a little. So I think that's in reference to, do you think Martha's mad? Yeah. Titus says, I think it's a sign of Martha's growth of trust in Jesus because she doesn't seem to have as strong a faith as her sister Mary, at least the way she's portrayed. Yeah, that's an interesting thing in sort of the story of Martha and Mary. They have stories where Martha seems to be more concerned with sort of like worldly stuff and doesn't have as much faith as Mary. And like, that's been the way that she's been sort of portrayed in Christian history. And so maybe that was supposed to be a sign of like, look how Martha has grown, that the first time she meets with Jesus, she's like all busy and doing other things. And now she meets Jesus and she's like the first person to go see him. And she is like telling him that she believes that he can do whatever he needs to do. So maybe that's like trying to be a growth narrative for her. I don't know. Robin says she seems very distraught more than angry. She's expressing her frustration and feeling like he was a little too late because he could have prevented it. Yeah. Yeah. I think all of these are great possibilities. I think all of these situations they could all be true. Martha could have been feeling all of these things. She could have been feeling anger and sadness and trust and exhaustion. Like she could have been feeling all of these things because grief is many things altogether. So it might be doing her a disservice to try to say what one thing is she feeling, because it could have been all these things at the same time. Yeah. Aaron says she also could have just chosen her words carefully so she could accuse without coming across totally accusatory. It's true. It could be the kind of thing where she said that first sentence about like, if you would have just been here, and then she's like, oh crap, I gotta like get over my tracks for a second here and like say something nicer. Like it could have been that sort of thing where you say one thing in sort of the heat of that moment of like, I'm angry, and then immediately after you regret saying it and you try to like say something else to smooth things over. That could be too. Honestly, though, I just find Martha so relatable in this moment where she's like, Jesus, if you would have just been here, like angry Martha, I am here for. Because I think the reason that I think that's so important is because I think it shows us that it's okay to be mad at God when somebody dies, when somebody that's close to you dies. Even Jesus's closest friends were like, what the heck? I think this shows us that you can be angry and Jesus doesn't seem to get mad about that. And we're going to look at that again. It happens again in the next chunk. So this is not the only time it happens. If this is said in anger, that's not the only time it happens. But Jesus doesn't get mad. He asks questions, right? I think Jesus does a really great thing in this passage in that he keeps asking questions. So Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And Martha says, I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. So this thing that Martha is saying about resurrection on the last day, the group of Jewish folks that they would have been a part of believed in a resurrection of the dead eventually, kind of on a judgment day, right? So she's pointing to that. She's saying, like, that's what I believe in. Of course, he'll rise again then. But then Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? One thing that I love about that question, do you believe this? Every other time I've read this text, I've read it as Jesus asking that question, do you believe this, as like a test of Martha's faith. Like, hey, do you really believe this, Martha? Do you really think I can do it? Like it's some kind of test, like Martha has to say yes to this or Lazarus won't get raised. I don't know. That was always the way that I read it or heard it before. And I didn't like it. I didn't like this idea that Jesus was like, say that you believe and then I'll do it, because that doesn't really mesh. It doesn't feel like with the Jesus that we know from these Gospels. So this time when I read it a little bit differently. And I wonder if maybe you've read it like this before and I'm just late to the party here. But when I read it where he says, do you believe this? And he's talking about everyone who believes in me will not die, they will have eternal life. And he says, do you believe this? I wonder in that moment if Jesus was asking Martha if she believed it, not because of Lazarus, but because of Martha herself. Like, what if Jesus wanted Martha to say yes because he wanted her to have that eternal life, right? It makes me think of sometimes when you lose a person close to you, you lose a friend, you lose a person that you love, you hold the other people close to you even closer because you recognize how important they are. And I wonder if maybe that's a little bit what Jesus could be doing in that moment, where Jesus is like, I recognize that Lazarus is gone in this moment, and I'm holding Martha as close as I can. Do you believe this, Martha? Because I want you to have this eternal life. So that was how I read it this time, and I've never read it like that before. So if any of you have different takes on how you think this moment between Jesus and Martha is going, I'd love to know. Jude says, I read it as a comforting thing, like, are you hearing me? Yeah, I think it's almost like you get it? It could be like Jesus explains something and then asks her if he's made himself clear. That could definitely be. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to understand what's going on between Jesus and Martha in this moment. So let's move on to our second chunk of text here. The next chunk of text we're going to be reading is verses 28 through 37. So that's the next chunk, 28 through 37. So I just want to make sure, because there's such a lag between what I say and what chat sees, I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. Yeah. People just agreeing, so that's nice. Okay, so the next section we're going to read here is verses 28 through 37. So they go like this. So when Martha had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, the teacher is here and calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, Where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. And Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said to him, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? So, in this second section here, we get a distinctly different interaction between Mary and Jesus than we did between Martha and Jesus. A couple of things are different, but I think the main difference is Jesus' emotional state, right? He goes from this sort of detached, theological type of thing to really emotionally feeling this in an incredibly deep way with Mary. And so I've got a lot of questions for us as we kind of dive into this second section. But I guess my first biggest question is, what do you think accounts for this difference between Jesus' interactions with Martha and Jesus' interactions with Mary? Why do you think they're different? Why do you think, what's the difference? What's the different variable? I think one of the variables that I notice is the crowd of people, right? There's a bunch of Jewish folks who are mourning with Mary, and they all come along. So the first sort of interaction was Jesus and Martha, two people alone. And the second group is Jesus and Martha and this group of mourners that's with her. Or Jesus and Mary and the group of mourners. So that's a little bit different. That we've got kind of more people involved now in this second interaction than the first one. But what do you think? Like, what's the difference here? Why does Jesus react so much more strongly in this second interaction than he did in the first one? While we're thinking about that, just a weird note. I don't know. This is a thing that I don't know about. That first, in verse 28, where Martha goes back and she tells her sister Mary, the teacher is here and calling for you. We never hear that Jesus is calling for Mary. And maybe he did, and it's just not in the text. But it's weird that Martha goes and says that after, like, we have no record of Jesus saying that. So just a weird thing. I don't know what it says. Aaron says, I feel like this is a great display of empathy from Jesus. He's mirroring each sister's emotions. Martha approaches things more logically, and Mary approaches things more emotionally. This is a possible explanation why Jesus cries at this point, because Mary is crying when she meets him. Yeah, so that's like right in the moment where Jesus is like emotionally like really wrenched is the moment where Mary is emotionally wrenched, right? When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. So it's like in that moment when he sees them and he sees their emotions, I think you're right on, Aaron, that he's mirroring what's happening here. Which is not to say that he's not feeling it himself. Like, I think, have you ever been in one of those situations where it's like you don't realize how deeply something is hitting you until somebody else starts reacting deeply, and then you're like, oh yes, okay, good, time to just fall apart together, right? So maybe that's kind of what's going on. But it is this real moment of empathetic, compassionate, like it gets to the heart of the word compassion, right? So the word compassion is Latin, and passion means suffering. Compassion means suffering with. To be compassionate is to suffer with someone, which is not really how we think about that word today, but that's like the root, right? And this is Jesus being compassionate. He is suffering with Mary in that moment, which is really powerful. Amory also points out that Mary seems more dramatic in her expression, falling or kneeling at Jesus' feet. Yeah, Mary's whole body is involved in this grief at this moment. Martha, like, gets up and walks out, but she seems to still be kind of like, she's emotional, but she's still in control. And Mary seems totally, like, overwrought by her emotions. And I think we've all been in places where we're more like Martha and in places when we're more like Mary. Julia says, I always heard this story as God will always meet you where you are. Totally. I love that. Robin says, because Mary sees this as a complete loss, whereas Martha has hope that there can be something more after this. That's an interesting point. So Robin, like looking at what Mary and Martha have both said, Martha has said something specifically about like, but I know God will do whatever you ask. Whereas Mary doesn't have that like statement, right? She just says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, right? So Mary doesn't have, which is interesting when we think back to, I think it was Titus who said earlier about how there's sort of like the progression of faith where it seemed like before Mary was the one who had more faith and Martha had less, and now Martha's showing more faith and Mary like isn't expressing that in the same way. So it's an interesting kind of reversal if we read it that way. I don't know, like my personal reading of this, I don't think either one of them is lacking in faith, but I think maybe Martha is expressing something, expressing a sense of like, God, or Jesus, I know you can do this, so maybe please do it. Whereas Mary is just totally overwrought. She doesn't know what the next step is because she's in that moment of grief, right? I think it's because Martha seems to be more analytical, right? She's already thinking about like what's the next thing to do, what's the next thing that's going to happen, whereas Mary is so in the moment of grief and loss and pain that she can't see what the next thing is going to be. And that's totally legitimate. Like these people are grieving, they're two people that are grieving differently, right? Robin says, Jesus is more emotional because he's being compassionate to the fact that Mary was lacking in belief of what God can do or what I can see. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. So if we're reading Mary and Martha as, like we're looking at their sort of faith or lack of faith, if Mary is less convinced that something good is going to come out of this. Jesus is going further to get to her, right? Maybe kind of making that, maybe Martha didn't need Jesus to be emotional because she's trying to like keep things together. And like it'd be like, when you're younger and something bad happens, and if your parent breaks down, you're like, well, they've broken down. I don't know what the world's coming to, right? So maybe for Martha, if Jesus would have expressed that level of suffering or grief, maybe Martha wouldn't have been able to handle it. Whereas for Mary, she needs Jesus to express that, to know that he really cared about her brother and cares about them. That could definitely be. Yeah. So I think one of the things, that we notice is that, or that I notice, is that Mary and Martha both have that moment of, if you would have been here, our brother wouldn't have died. And so I think that's the reason why I find this story to be so helpful for thinking about the fact that anger can be part of grief, and that anger is not a bad emotion. I think a lot of us maybe have experienced anger as a negative and scary thing, and so we start to think about anger as always being negative and scary, or something that you shouldn't feel or shouldn't express. And so to see both Mary and Martha say that, like, if you would have been here, our brother wouldn't have died, that especially to be angry or confused, or, to have that in God, put that in God's direction, is not a bad thing. That's an okay thing to do in the midst of grief. And Jesus responds to that in the way that makes sense for us. Jesus speaks in our language, right? In Martha's language or in Mary's language, which is really powerful. I think one of the things, too, that I was looking at, so I'm not a Greek scholar. I'm a Hebrew guy, but I do my best I can with Greek. But I was looking at the Greek for one particular verse, the verse about Jesus being greatly moved, because I remember learning at some point about that particular verse. And so I just thought I'd give us one little tidbit of sort of an interesting factoid about the Greek going on in this verse. So in verse, in verse 33, where Jesus saw her weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. I looked up the Greek for that because I wanted to take a look at it. And the greatly disturbed, that greatly disturbed in spirit bit, the word for that is a word that is often used in other parts of the New Testament alongside anger or frustration. And it's a word that has to do with making a groaning noise. And it's interesting to me to think about what that image would look like for Jesus, like Jesus grieving, not just crying, but also like wailing or groaning, right? Making this sort of noise, expressing grief, is something that's very powerful to me. Like the idea of Jesus just like shedding tears, but not being overly worked up is one thing, but a Jesus who's like full body, like sobbing, moaning, crying is something that feels like he is really experiencing that grief, and that seems to be kind of what the Greek is getting to, is that Jesus is having this sort of full vocal experience of grief. Where it says he was deeply moved, the Greek for that has to do with the words that you use to talk about troubled water, like super, like mucky, like in a storm type of water. So if you can imagine, what Jesus is feeling is this sense of like internal, like turmoil. Turmoil is the best word for it, right? Tumultuous water. And that's what he's feeling internally. And I think both of those things, the sort of full body sound of grief and the inner turmoil, is like something that we experience when we're going through grief. At least a lot of us do. Yeah, Jude says, King James Version says he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Yeah, King James Version, it's not always the best, but there are some moments where it seems like they're spot on. And I think that's one of them, where it's like he groaned in spirit and was troubled, like troubling the waters, right? So I think that's a pretty great translation. So yeah, for me, it was just helpful to think about that as a visual, right? And an auditory thing, rather than just like Jesus shed some tears, because this was much more of a deep thing than that, I think. So the last sort of thing that about this section before we read our last section is that I find it interesting and helpful to notice what happens after this moment, right? Jesus is weeping, and he says, "Where have you laid him?" They said, "Lord, come and see." And then Jesus began to weep. And it's interesting to me that Jesus, like, I see this as a moment of the people trying to make the next thing happen. They're like, "Okay, Jesus, come to the tomb, come and see. Like, let's get the show on the move. Like, we got to get you over here." And Jesus is so in the midst of his grief, he doesn't go right away. He doesn't move. He sits and he cries. He sits and he experiences that grief in a deep way. And he doesn't go until a couple of verses later. They're saying, "Look how he loved him." They like have a whole conversation while Jesus is sitting there crying, right? And then Jesus goes to the tomb. And I think that's a really important reminder for us when we're dealing with grief, that you can't just skip to the next thing. You can't just like go on with your daily life. You can't just get the show on the road. It can't just be a show must go on type of thing. There are times when you just have to sit and cry. And I think Jesus is showing that to us. Jesus is showing us that like there are times when it's not the right thing to do to jump to the resurrection. And if you all have been watching the videos that I've been making for some years, I've talked a lot about the importance of Holy Saturday in Easter week and Holy Week, the time between when Jesus dies and the resurrection, and how important that middle space is, because we shouldn't just skip right to the good news. We can't just skip right to Jesus' resurrection or Lazarus' resurrection without experiencing that grief. And that's, I think, what Jesus is showing us here, that we can have the moment and the time to sit together in community and grieve without having to just get on with it and pretend things are fine. Yeah, Titus says, "I like how Jesus doesn't expect Mary to repress her emotions. He sits there with her." Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that could have been part of what was going on too. Like, what if the crowd of people were like, "Jesus, let's get you to the tomb," and Mary wasn't ready to move yet, and Jesus waits with her, right? That could definitely be part of what's going on here. Maybe even if Jesus was ready to move, he knew that Mary wasn't, and so he stays with her. Could definitely be. So let's go on and read our last section here together. The last section is verses 38 through 44. All right. So 38 through 44 goes like this. "Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, feeling that inner turmoil, that groaning, he came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, 'Take away the stone.' Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, 'Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days.' Jesus said to her, 'Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?' So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, 'Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me.' When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come out.' The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in the cloth. Jesus said to them, 'Unbind him and let him go.'" So that's the end of this part of the story. And sort of the end of this scene, I guess you would say. and Lazarus is raised, right? Lazarus is raised back to life. I think, I don't know, it's super powerful, right? Good. Jude is giving us another great King James Version translation. Oh my gosh, the King James. I know. It's like, I love that sort of like the sensory thing that we have going on in this particular story. There's a lot of sensory stuff happening. And one of them is the smell, right? There's concern about like, well, he's been dead for 4 days, so there's going to be a smell. Um, and if you're at all curious about sort of like the burial ritual that's going on here, what would happen in these ancient Jewish households is that if you die with like you are buried in a tomb the day that you die. Like the idea is that you bury a body pretty soon after death, because they didn't, and Jewish folks today still don't do an embalming, which is what I think a lot of folks do, which means that your body doesn't decompose as fast. So in the ancient Jewish world, they would put a body in a tomb and they would leave the body there for almost a year. It was something like 11 months or so. And so the body would be in that tomb, and it would decompose in the tomb. And then after a year, you go in, family members go in and they collect the bones, and they put the bones in a special container. And then that container goes next to the containers of all the ancestors whose bones are there. So that's kind of the process that's going on here. So Lazarus has been in the tomb decomposing for 4 days. So one of the things that we think about why Jesus waited 4 days to go there, like why the number 4 specifically, is because at this time it was thought that your soul kind of stuck around your body for about 3 days after you died. And so Jesus is waiting to the 4th day to kind of make a point about like, this isn't just Lazarus's spirit, like he's only mostly dead. Like it wasn't, he's trying to make a point about like the fact that Lazarus is fully dead and is raised back to life. So that's what the stinketh sense situation is here. So yeah, this is sort of the last section here where we get Lazarus raised to life, and it's interesting. I think what Jesus does here, where he prays, and the way that Jesus prays here gets me every time. Verse 42, he says, "I know that you always hear me, but I've said this for the sake of the crowd standing here." There's something about that line that I love. This idea that Jesus is like, I know, but like I need to show everybody else. And I just find so much comfort in that line, in the way that Jesus is specifically showing people what they need to see. He's, again, meeting them where they're at. That's really, really powerful to me. And then sort of the last thing that happens, which is Jesus calls Lazarus out. He cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man comes out, his hands and feet bound with the strips of burial cloth, his face wrapped in linen. And Jesus says, "Unbind him." So I have actually preached on this passage a couple of times for Coming Out Day, believe it or not, because of this moment where Jesus says, "Come out." And I think this is a moment that is super metaphorical for those of us that are LGBTQ+, where Jesus asks somebody to come forward out of death. What we thought was death can be very similar to a coming out process for a lot of people, that we go into not knowing if we're going to survive, and then we come out and Jesus calls us into new life. But the thing that I find most relevant about this scene as a coming out narrative is what Jesus says to the people, that Jesus says, "Unbind him," right? And that to me is a call to community, that we should always be unbinding each other, right? We should always be setting each other free. And what does that look like in any situation? So I just wanted to throw that in there because I think it's such a relevant metaphor for us. But thinking about like like death and grief, I think it's also relevant for us to ask each other, what can we do as community when we are going through grief, when we are dealing with death? How can we still work to unbind each other? What does that look like? And I think one of the things that we can do is talking about our grief and experiencing our grief in community rather than in isolation. We can unbind together, not by ourselves. So I think, yeah, I wonder what you all think about this sense of like unbinding, and what it might look like to unbind each other in community. What might it look like for us to unbind each other in the midst of dealing with grief? So that's where I'm going to leave it for us tonight, is leaving you with that question: how do we unbind each other in our grief? But I hope that the thing that we all take away from this is the experience of grieving, of Jesus grieving with us, of Jesus meeting us where we are, of Jesus responding to our questions and concerns and our anger, that it's okay to be angry and it's okay to feel all of these feelings and it's okay to talk about it. I think this story shows us all of those things, which are all really important for dealing with grief. Knowing that God is there in the midst of it is, I think, the most important thing. Knowing that God has experienced it. What does it mean for us that God has experienced the loss of a loved one? That's intense, right? That means something for us, that God really gets it. So I hope that we can remember that. So that's where I'm going to leave us this week. I hope this was helpful or interesting or a good time for us to be together. I really enjoyed it. Thank you all for sending in your comments and talking to me about your thoughts about this particular passage. It's such a great one and one that I go back to all the time. So thanks for being here for it. If you, let's see if this works. I'm going to try something. Nope, not going to work. I tried something out, but it didn't work. We have a calendar over at, I'm trying to get a special bot in our chat that will show us when, will show up certain commands for us. But in the meantime, before that works, oh, it did work. It's right there. Haha. To find out when to join the next group or study, click that link. The link in the chat, that is. So I'm glad that worked. So if you want to get involved, we've got a Transmission Ministry Collective has a support group tomorrow afternoon, late morning if you're on Pacific time. And if you want to get involved with that, you can connect with our support group. Let's see if this works. Haha. That link should bring something up as well. So if you want to get involved with our support groups or anything like that, you can go to our website and get signed up, and you'll be ready to go for tomorrow. Yes, there we go. To sign up for TMC support groups, click here. So you can click there or copy that link or whatever you need to do. So you've got those links. Our next Bible study will be on April 20th. So April 20th will be our next Bible study, same time, same place. And until then, I hope you all are able to take care of each other, unbind each other, and remember that God's with you no matter what, through whatever. So we'll see you next time, everybody. Peace.